After months of deployment, I was finally back on leave. The long, exhausting days of serving in the U.S. Army were behind me for now, and all I could think about was getting home to my wife, Rachel. I had missed her terribly. The sound of her voice, her laugh, the way she smiled when she saw me. Everything about her had kept me going during those hard nights overseas. When I stepped through the front door of our home, I expected the warm embrace I had dreamed of, the excitement I felt mirrored in her eyes. But something was different. Rachel's smile felt off, strained even, and the hug she gave me was short, more obligatory than heartfelt. I brushed it aside, telling myself it had been months since we'd seen each other. Maybe she was just overwhelmed. But the days that followed didn't bring the closeness I'd hoped for. Instead, she seemed distant, preoccupied with her phone more than usual, spending more time texting than talking to me. Every time I asked her how she was doing, she'd give me the same answer, "I'm fine," with a half-hearted smile. At first, I tried to push my suspicions away. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, that I needed to adjust after being away for so long. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't leave me alone. Rachel was pulling away from me, and I couldn't understand why. Then came the whispers. It started with a comment from our elderly neighbors, a sweet couple who lived across the street. They mentioned casually that they had seen Rachel spending a lot of time with Mr. Dawson, our neighbor who lived a few doors down. I laughed it off. Mr. Dawson was nearly 55, a kind older man who'd always been around. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I found myself watching Rachel more closely. Her behavior was off. There were moments when she seemed lost in thought, her mood swinging from distant to strangely energetic after disappearing for hours. The more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore the signs. She was hiding something from me, and I wasn't sure I was ready to find out what it was. Once the seed of doubt was planted, it became impossible to ignore the signs. Rachel's behavior grew stranger with each passing day. The coldness between us persisted, but what bothered me most were her unexplained absences. She would go out, claiming to run errands, but return hours later with barely a word. When I asked what she had been doing, she'd brush off my questions with vague answers like, "I just needed some fresh air." But it wasn't just her behavior at home that troubled me. I noticed that she seemed to light up after these absences. Her mood would shift. She'd return smiling, almost glowing, and her energy level was completely different. It was a stark contrast to the distant, disengaged woman I had come home to. I knew something was wrong, but I had no proof, only a growing knot of suspicion in my gut. I couldn't shake the neighbor's comment about Mr. Dawson either. At first, it seemed ridiculous. He was a man in his mid-50s, twice her age, quiet and unassuming. But once the thought had lodged itself in my mind, I began to look at things differently. I started paying more attention, noting the small, seemingly insignificant details. The way Rachel would check her phone constantly, then smile at messages she tried to hide from me. There was a tension in the air between us that hadn't been there before. One evening, while I was outside doing some yard work, I noticed Mr. Dawson standing by his porch, watching Rachel as she got into her car. There was something unsettling in the way he looked at her, something that made my skin crawl. They exchanged a glance, brief but knowing. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized this wasn't just in my head. The next day, I made a decision. I told Rachel I had to cut my leave short and head back to base. Her reaction was subtle but telling. She didn't seem upset, nor did she try to convince me to stay longer. Instead, she simply nodded, saying, "I understand. Duty calls, right?" Her words sounded hollow, as if she had been expecting me to leave. It stung, but I pushed the hurt aside, determined to find out the truth. I packed a small bag and kissed her goodbye, telling her I'd be back after a few days. But instead of heading back to base, I drove to a hotel a few towns away, where I planned to keep a low profile and observe Rachel's movements. I wasn't going to confront her without knowing the full extent of what was happening. From the hotel, I kept a close eye on our house. At first, everything seemed normal. Rachel went about her usual routine. But on the second day, I noticed her leave the house in the afternoon, dressed a little more casually than usual. My instincts told me to follow her, so I discreetly tailed her as she drove out of town. My heart sank when I saw her pull up to Mr. Dawson's house. I parked a few houses down and waited. Rachel didn't come out for hours. When she finally did, it was as if she had transformed. She was smiling, genuinely smiling, something I hadn't seen in a long time. The weight that had been dragging her down at home seemed to have vanished, and she looked happy. It was a look that used to be reserved for me, and it broke my heart. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe they were just friends. Maybe she was going through something and needed someone to talk to. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. My suspicions were growing stronger by the day, and I needed to know just how deep this betrayal went. A few days later, I decided to take my investigation a step further. While Rachel was out, I went through her phone. She had been careful. Most of the messages had been deleted, and there was no glaring evidence of anything inappropriate. But in one of the few conversations she hadn't erased, I found a string of casual exchanges with Mr. Dawson. At first glance, the messages seemed harmless talk of golfing together, compliments about her swing. But the tone, the familiarity, it wasn't the way you spoke to a neighbor. Something about it felt off. And then I found a message from Dawson, asking when they could meet up again. It was short, simple, and devastating. All the pieces began to fall into place. The absences, the secretive behavior, the odd mood swings. Rachel wasn't just being friendly with the neighbor. She was involved with him. My stomach churned, and my hands trembled as I put her phone down. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut, but I wasn't done yet. I needed undeniable proof, something I could confront her with that she couldn't deny or explain away. I began following her more closely, tracking her movements whenever she left the house. Each time, she ended up at Mr. Dawson's. Sometimes they would stay at his place, sometimes they'd go out to the city. I followed them one afternoon to a restaurant outside of town. They sat at a corner booth, sharing a quiet, intimate dinner. They looked like a couple, a sight that made my blood boil. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I needed more. So, I continued to watch, gathering the pieces of her betrayal, each one stabbing deeper than the last. With my suspicions now confirmed, I found it impossible to think of anything else. The image of Rachel walking out of Mr. Dawson's house, looking so alive, haunted me. Her energy and smile, things I had missed, were now for someone else, a man old enough to be her father. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? How could she lie to me so easily, day after day? But more than anything, I needed solid proof, something concrete that she couldn't deny. I continued to follow her movements whenever I could, careful to stay out of sight. It didn't take long to notice the pattern. Every couple of days, she would find an excuse to leave the house, errands, a trip to the gym, or sometimes just going for a drive to clear her head. But each time, her destination was the same: Mr. Dawson's house. I watched from a distance as she slipped inside, staying for hours, then leaving with that same happy, light-hearted expression. The hardest part wasn't the waiting or the surveillance. It was the growing realization that this wasn't a fleeting affair. This wasn't a mistake. Rachel was fully invested in whatever was happening between her and Dawson. The thought turned my stomach, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. One day, I followed them as they left Dawson's house together. They were laughing, carefree, like a couple on a casual date. I kept my distance as they drove into the city. My heart pounded as I watched them park near a small hotel, one I had never seen before. I pulled into a lot across the street and watched as they walked into the hotel together, hand in hand. It felt like my world was crashing down around me. They didn't come out for hours. By the time they emerged, it was dark, and they looked just as relaxed as before. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to contain the anger bubbling inside me. This was more than I could handle, but still, I needed something more, something undeniable. I couldn't confront Rachel and have her twist her way out of it. She was a master of excuses and deflections, and I needed evidence that would leave her speechless. The next day, I made a bold decision. I waited for Rachel to leave the house, then let myself in. I knew her phone was the key, and I needed to check it again. She had been careful to delete most of her messages, but there had to be something she missed. After searching through her apps and social media, I found a hidden folder on her phone, one that contained photos. My stomach churned as I scrolled through them. There were photos of her and Dawson, smiling, standing close together. Most were innocent enough at first, pictures of them golfing, walking around town, even having lunch together. But then there were more. Pictures of them at the same hotel I had seen them go into. In one, they were standing on the balcony, their faces so close, their expressions too familiar. It was undeniable. The betrayal was staring me in the face, but I needed more than photos. I searched further, finding a chat app one hadn't seen before. The messages were there, flirtatious, full of inside jokes and plans for their next meetings. Dawson wrote to her late at night, asking when she could sneak away again. Rachel responded eagerly, excited about their secret rendezvous. It was all laid out in front of me, everything I needed to know. The betrayal was real, deep, and ongoing. It wasn't just the casual affair I had feared. It was something that had grown into a full-blown relationship behind my back. They had shared dinners, hotel stays, and God knows what else while I had been away serving my country, trusting that Rachel would be there when I came home. Now I realized that while I had been away fighting battles overseas, she had been waging her own war on our marriage, destroying the trust and loyalty that had once bound us together. The following week, I decided to take things further. If I was going to confront her, I needed to see them together in a more public setting. I followed them to a restaurant outside the city, one of those dimly lit, romantic spots that people go to for special occasions. They sat at a corner booth, their heads close together, whispering and laughing. It was clear they were more than just neighbors. They looked comfortable, like they had done this countless times before. I snapped photos of them from across the street, my hands shaking with anger as I documented every smile, every stolen glance. They were completely oblivious to my presence, wrapped up in their little world. Watching them hurt more than anything I had ever experienced. My wife, the woman I thought I knew so well, was sitting across from another man, sharing a meal that should have been with me. I felt the betrayal twist deeper inside me, cutting sharper with each passing moment. But it wasn't just a dinner. I followed them back to the hotel once more, watching as they disappeared inside. I had all the evidence I needed, and now it was time to confront her. No more hiding, no more waiting for the perfect moment. I had seen enough. I drove home that night, seething with anger and betrayal. I knew that when I walked through that door, everything would change. My life, my marriage, it was all about to come crashing down. The next time I saw Rachel, I would confront her with the truth, and I was going to make sure she couldn't deny it. The weight of my discovery was unbearable, but I knew the time had come to confront Rachel. I had followed her enough, collected more evidence than I ever wanted to, and now, with the photos, messages, and everything I had seen, there was no room left for doubt. My marriage was over, and the truth had to come out. That evening, I made my move. I told Rachel I was returning home early from work and that we needed to talk. I could sense a flicker of nervousness in her voice when she responded, but she tried to mask it, keeping her tone calm and cheerful. "Of course, we'll talk when you get home," she said. The sound of her voice twisted the knife further. How could she still pretend everything was normal? I arrived home, heart pounding, hands trembling as I gripped the door handle. The living room lights were dimmed, and Rachel was sitting on the couch, sipping tea, looking far too composed for what I was about to unleash. She smiled weakly when she saw me, a forced attempt at normalcy, but I wasn't falling for it anymore. "Sit down," I said, my voice cold and firm. She hesitated, her smile faltering. "We need to talk." She sat down, sensing the tension in the air, but still playing the part of the innocent wife. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. Without a word, I scrolled through the photos and messages I had saved, then turned the screen towards her. Rachel's eyes widened as she looked at the images, pictures of her and Dawson at the restaurant, walking into the hotel together, laughing like they were in their own little world. Her reaction was instant. The blood drained from her face, and she looked up at me, wide-eyed, stammering. "It's not what it looks like," but I wasn't going to let her wriggle out of this. "Don't lie to me, Rachel. I know everything." My voice was low, trembling with the anger I had been holding back for so long. "I followed you. I saw you with him. I saw you at the hotel. I saw the way you looked at him, the way you laughed with him. You've been lying to me for months." Tears began to well up in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. This wasn't the time for sympathy. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. I can explain. Explain what? I snapped, slamming my phone down on the coffee table. Explain how you've been sneaking around with the neighbor? How you've been betraying me while I've been gone? There's nothing left to explain, Rachel. I know everything. She broke down then, sobbing uncontrollably, but still trying to defend herself. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for this. You didn't mean for it to happen? I interrupted, my voice rising. You didn't mean to sneak around behind my back? You didn't mean to laugh with him, to spend hours in a hotel with him? That's your excuse? Rachel was shaking, tears streaming down her face, but I wasn't done. You let this happen, Rachel. You chose this. You chose him over me, over everything we've built together. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me? She wiped her tears, struggling to speak through the sobs. It started a few months ago. I didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened. I was lonely, and he was there for me. I don't know what I was thinking. Lonely? I repeated, my voice cold. I was gone, serving our country, and you were lonely? So you thought betraying me with our neighbor was the solution? How could you do this to me, Rachel? She had no answer. She just sat there, sobbing, head in her hands. The room was filled with the weight of her guilt, but it did nothing to ease my pain. The woman I had trusted with everything, my heart, my future, had shattered it all without a second thought. The silence that followed was suffocating. Rachel tried again to speak, but I stopped her. Don't. I've heard enough. I don't need to hear your excuses or your apologies. It's too late for that. Her eyes met mine, filled with remorse, but it didn't matter anymore. The trust was broken beyond repair. I stood up, my heart heavy with the reality of what I had to do next. We're done, Rachel, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. I can't do this anymore. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I pulled away. Please, don't leave me, she begged, her voice desperate. I'll make it right, I promise. But it was too late. I had seen everything I needed to see, heard everything I needed to hear. There was no going back. Without another word, I walked out of the living room, leaving Rachel sobbing on the couch, the sound of her broken pleas echoing behind me. I could hear Rachel's sobs behind me as I walked out of the living room, but they felt distant, almost unreal. I went upstairs, needing a moment to clear my head before the final confrontation. Everything had been laid bare, the truth, the lies, the betrayal. There was no escaping it anymore, for either of us. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, the room where we had shared so many moments, now feeling like a hollow shell of what it once was. The walls seemed to close in around me as I replayed everything in my head. The laughter, the photos, the messages. It all came crashing down, and for the first time, I realized just how deep the wound went. I couldn't avoid her anymore. I had to face the reality of what had happened. I walked back downstairs, steeling myself for what was to come. Rachel was still sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. When she heard me approach, she looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with a mixture of shame and desperation. Please, just listen to me, she begged, her voice barely a whisper. I know I hurt you, but I can fix this. I can make things right. I stood in front of her, arms crossed, my heart hardened by the betrayal. How? I asked, my voice cold and steady. How do you plan to make this right, Rachel? You've been lying to me for months. You've been sneaking around with Dawson, of all people. How can we possibly come back from this? She wiped at her tears, struggling to find the words. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she stammered. I don't know why it happened. I didn't want to hurt you, but you did. My voice was firm, but beneath it, I felt the cracks forming. You did hurt me, Rachel. You didn't just betray me, you destroyed everything. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying? Her eyes fell to the floor. About 6 months, she admitted, her voice so soft it was barely audible. It started after you left. I was just so lonely, and Dawson, he was there. I didn't mean for it to happen. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. Lonely? That's your excuse? I was gone, serving overseas, trusting you to be here when I got back. And you decided the best way to deal with that was to sneak around with our neighbor? I never meant for it to go this far, she insisted, her voice cracking. I wasn't thinking. I made a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, my voice rising with anger. A mistake is something that happens once, not something you keep doing for 6 months behind my back. You chose this, Rachel. Every time you went to him, every time you lied to me, you made that choice. Her tears flowed freely now, her face a picture of regret. I'm so sorry, she cried. Please, give me another chance. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. But her words meant nothing. The damage was done, and there was no fixing it. There's nothing left to fix, I said, my voice hollow. You broke us. You broke everything. The silence between us was thick, filled with everything that had gone unsaid for months. Rachel looked up at me one last time, her eyes pleading, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't stay. I'm leaving, I said, turning towards the door. I can't stay here anymore. She stood up, reaching out to stop me, but I moved away from her grasp. Please, don't leave, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'll do anything. But there was nothing left to say. Without another word, I walked out the front door, leaving Rachel standing alone, surrounded by the wreckage of what we once had. Leaving Rachel and our shattered marriage behind should have brought me some relief, but all I felt was an unbearable emptiness. The betrayal was like a poison seeping into every thought, every moment. I had walked out, but the pain followed me. Even though I knew the marriage was over, the weight of it stayed with me, crushing me with each passing day. I spent the first few weeks after the confrontation in a fog, going through the motions. I'd moved into a hotel, trying to focus on work and distracting myself from the wreckage of my personal life. But no matter how hard I tried, thoughts of Rachel's betrayal with Dawson kept creeping back in, like an open wound that refused to heal. Anger was the only thing that cut through the haze, and it came in waves: deep, burning rage. How could she, after everything we had been through, everything I had sacrificed? It wasn't just the betrayal, but the fact that she had chosen someone like Dawson, an older man, a neighbor I had trusted. The betrayal stung even deeper because it wasn't just about losing my wife. It was about being humiliated in my own home. That humiliation turned into a desire for revenge. The thought of getting back at Rachel consumed me. I didn't want to just walk away. I wanted her to feel the same level of pain that she had caused me. I wanted her to know that I wasn't someone she could walk all over and forget. She needed to understand what it was like to lose everything, and I knew exactly how to do it. Rachel's younger sister, Emily, had always been close to us, especially during the earlier years of our marriage. She was beautiful, charismatic, and worked as a model, often traveling for work. But beyond her stunning appearance, Emily had always shown me kindness, and while I had never thought of her in any inappropriate way before, now that I was free from Rachel, the idea started to take hold. Emily had always admired me. It was subtle small gestures, lingering glances, the way she complimented me at family gatherings. I knew she respected me as a man, but after everything with Rachel, those small gestures took on new meaning. She became the perfect tool for my revenge. I didn't reach out to Emily immediately. I played the long game, allowing my anger to simmer while making sure my actions would be calculated, not impulsive. I wanted Rachel to feel the full weight of her mistake before I struck. One afternoon, I casually reached out to Emily, pretending to need someone to talk to about the divorce. She had already heard about the breakup and seemed genuinely sorry for what had happened. I never thought Rachel would do something like this, she said during our conversation. You don't deserve this. I played the role of the heartbroken husband well, telling Emily how devastated I was, how lost I felt. It didn't take long for her to offer support, and soon, we were meeting regularly for coffee or lunch. Each time, I made sure to slowly build a rapport, deepening the connection between us. Emily, oblivious to my intentions, responded with sympathy and kindness, and I could tell she was falling for me, piece by piece. One night, after a particularly emotional conversation, I invited her to my hotel room. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, but there was something else there too: curiosity, attraction. The line between emotional support and something more blurred, and before either of us knew it, the tension that had been building between us snapped. We spent the evening together, though I won't go into the details. What mattered most wasn't the act itself, but the power it gave me over Rachel. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and I knew that when Rachel found out, it would shatter her just as she had shattered me. Emily and I kept our relationship discreet for a few weeks, but I didn't plan on keeping it a secret forever. I wanted Rachel to know. I wanted her to realize that I had moved on not just with anyone, but with someone close to her, someone she never would have expected. I wanted her to feel the sting of betrayal in the same way I had, and she did. I'll never forget the day Rachel found out. It was at a family gathering, of all places. I had been invited, despite the divorce, and Emily and I arrived together, acting as if nothing was out of the ordinary. The moment Rachel saw us walk in together, her face went pale. She looked between Emily and me, confusion quickly turning to horror as she realized what was going on. Her voice trembled as she approached us. "What's going on?" she demanded, though I could tell she already knew. I didn't even flinch. "You wanted to throw everything away, Rachel," I said coldly, "so I found someone who appreciates me." Rachel's face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Emily, standing beside me, looked at her sister with a mix of guilt and defiance, but I could tell she was as shocked by Rachel's reaction as I was satisfied by it. "How could you?" Rachel's voice cracked, tears welling up in her eyes. I shrugged. "You're the one who destroyed our marriage, Rachel. You made your choices. Now I've made mine." It was a harsh, cutting statement, but it was the truth. Rachel had taken everything from me, and now I was taking something from her sense of control, her belief that she could break me without consequences. As she stood there, speechless, I could see the realization dawning on her. She had lost me, and worse, she had lost me to her own sister. Rachel walked out of the gathering, her face flushed with tears. I watched her go, feeling a twisted sense of victory. The tables had turned. She had betrayed me with a man I trusted, and now she would live with the knowledge that I had done the same with someone she cared about deeply. In the days that followed, I noticed a change in Rachel. She no longer called or tried to make things right. The guilt had eaten away at her, and I knew that the revenge had done its job. Emily and I kept our relationship short-lived. She was just a means to an end. Once Rachel had felt the full impact of her betrayal, I ended things with Emily, explaining that I needed to be alone for a while. She accepted it, though I could tell she was hurt. But I didn't care anymore. Revenge had served its purpose. In the end, it wasn't about love or rebuilding anything real. It was about reclaiming control, about showing Rachel that actions have consequences. I walked away from that part of my life with a sense of closure, knowing that I had settled the score in my own way. The pain was still there, but it was no longer sharp. It had dulled, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing that I had taken my power back. After the dust settled from my revenge, I was left with an unexpected emptiness. I thought getting back at Rachel by being with her sister would bring me closure, but instead, it only deepened the hollow feeling inside me. The brief satisfaction I felt when I saw Rachel's face at that family gathering had long since faded, replaced by a gnawing sense of loss. What I had done didn't heal the wounds. It only distracted me from them for a little while. Emily and I didn't speak much after we ended things. She had been hurt, not just by me, but by her own involvement in my scheme. It wasn't fair to her, and I knew that. I'd used her, just as Rachel had used me. The worst part was, in my quest for revenge, I had become something I hated: a manipulator, someone who treated others as tools for personal gain. It didn't sit well with me. Rachel, on the other hand, stayed away. After that final confrontation, she never tried to reach out. No texts, no phone calls. In a way, it was a relief, but there was also a strange sadness to it. The silence was loud. We had spent years building a life together, and now it was reduced to nothing: no communication, no attempts to salvage anything. Just silence. The divorce process moved quickly, neither of us wanting to drag it out. We divided our assets without much conflict, both eager to move on with our lives. Signing the papers felt like closing the door on a chapter of my life I was more than ready to forget. But even with the legal side behind me, the emotional toll lingered. I realized that the end of our marriage wasn't just about the betrayal, it was the loss of the life I thought we were building together. For weeks, I walked around in a fog, unsure of how to move forward. My time in the army had taught me resilience, but this was a different kind of battle. There were no enemies to fight, no missions to complete, just an endless, quiet war inside my own head. The revenge I had taken felt hollow now, a momentary release that only delayed the inevitable reckoning with my pain. I began spending more time alone, reflecting on everything that had happened. I tried to make sense of it all, how I had gotten here, how everything had fallen apart so quickly. I had always been someone who believed in loyalty, in honor. Rachel's betrayal had shattered those beliefs, and my response, my own betrayal with Emily, only compounded the damage. Slowly, I realized that I couldn't keep living in the past. What was done was done. Rachel had made her choices, and I had made mine. We were both responsible for the destruction of our marriage. No amount of revenge or bitterness was going to change that. One evening, I went back to our old house to gather the last of my things. Rachel wasn't home, which was probably for the best. As I walked through the empty rooms, I felt a strange sense of closure. The house, once filled with memories of love, laughter, and companionship, now felt like a shell, a place that no longer held any meaning for me. I left the keys on the kitchen counter and walked out for the last time, not looking back. It was time to move on. The aftermath of everything had taught me a hard lesson. Revenge might feel good in the moment, but it doesn't fix anything. It doesn't heal the pain or undo the betrayal. All it does is add more damage to an already broken situation. Now, I knew that the only way to truly move forward was to let go of the anger, the bitterness, and the need to hurt back. It wasn't easy, and the scars would always be there. But I had to find a way to rebuild without Rachel, without revenge, just me, figuring out who I was beyond the betrayal. It was time to start over. I felt a strange combination of relief and sadness. The chapter with Rachel was finally closed, but the path ahead felt uncertain. I had no idea what came next, but I knew that I had to focus on rebuilding my life, on finding a way to move forward. The first few weeks were tough. The emotional fallout from everything weighed heavily on me. I kept replaying the betrayal, the revenge, and the way it all unraveled. It was hard to let go of the anger, even though I knew it was pointless. Holding on to the resentment only kept me stuck in the past, and I didn't want to live there anymore. One day, I decided to reach out to a therapist. I realized I couldn't carry this weight alone anymore. At first, I was hesitant admitting that I needed help wasn't easy. But as soon as I stepped into that office and started talking, it felt like a release. For the first time in months, I could express everything I had been bottling up: the pain, the betrayal, the shame of what I had done in retaliation. The sessions helped me see things more clearly. I began to understand that my entire life had revolved around Rachel and the marriage I thought we had. When that was taken away, I was left with nothing but anger and a desire to hurt her back. But the therapist helped me see that my revenge didn't make me any better than her, it only prolonged my own suffering. Over time, I started to forgive myself for what had happened. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the bitterness still crept in. But I learned that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what Rachel or I had done. It was about freeing myself from the cycle of pain that kept me trapped. I couldn't move forward if I kept holding on to the past. I also began to realize that part of moving on meant rebuilding my identity outside of the relationship. For so long, I had defined myself by my marriage, my role as Rachel's husband. Now, I had to figure out who I was without that. It was a slow process, but I started by picking up old hobbies I had neglected, things I used to enjoy before everything got complicated. I reconnected with friends I hadn't spoken to in a while, started going to the gym more regularly, and even took up hiking. It felt good to focus on myself for a change, to take care of my own well-being instead of constantly worrying about Rachel and the mess she had created. One weekend, I decided to go on a solo trip, a kind of symbolic restart. I packed a bag and drove out to the mountains, spending a few days in a cabin surrounded by nature. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The solitude gave me space to reflect, but also to just exist without the constant pressure of my past weighing me down. Out there, surrounded by the quiet of the woods, I realized that moving forward wasn't about forgetting what had happened, it was about accepting it. The betrayal would always be a part of my story, but it didn't have to define me. I could choose to learn from it and build something new, something better. When I returned from the trip, I felt lighter, like I had shed a layer of the pain that had been clinging to me for so long. I wasn't fully healed, but I was healing, and that was enough. As time passed, I also began to think about love again. Not in a rush to jump into anything new, but in a hopeful way. I knew that not everyone would betray me like Rachel did. I could have another chance at building something real, but only if I approached it with trust, patience, and honesty. I wasn't ready just yet, but the thought didn't scare me anymore. It was something to look forward to, someday. Looking back, the entire experience had changed me in ways I never expected. It had tested my strength, my resilience, and forced me to confront the darkest parts of myself. But it also showed me that I could come out the other side, not just as a survivor, but as someone stronger, wiser, and more in tune with who I really was. Moving forward wasn't just about leaving Rachel behind. It was about rediscovering who I was outside of the pain, outside of the betrayal. It was about learning to love myself again and realizing that no matter what had happened in the past, I still had the power to shape my future. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt ready for whatever came next. I was no longer defined by the betrayal, no longer trapped by the anger. I was free to rebuild, free to move forward, and free to live the life I deserved.